G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day. You've had a fantastic weekend. I know it is a Sunday. The Sunday blues are a real thing. But on a good note, hopefully you're not starting chemotherapy tomorrow. I'm a little bit nervous for the week to come, knowing the week I had last time. Anyway, legends, enough about me. Of course, as always, we have to go over the news and the maps, and there is a lot to go over in this. And of course, we're going to be looking at some doctrine as well. So look, of course, we're going to look at the maps. We're going to compare maps, and I've got a couple of geolocations, and we're going to show you where maps are just ignoring geolocations as well. We need to then have a zoom in on what's happening in Kursk, and of course, some movements around Pokrovsk, as we have seen a bit of a lull in movements there, but things are starting to go again. But the main chunk of this video is going to be looking at attritional war. Who is winning the attritional battle? How propaganda affects then the informational aspect, how that then affects command decisions, and the actual doctrine around this. And something has come out from a high-level commander, which we have been reporting on for a long time, to do with Russia's then goals. And we're like, what decisions have been made due to not accepting this form of attritional warfare over maneuver and decisive attacks? And this tells us a lot about this reality versus ideals that is happening. And even if you just go listen to some bloggers online, it's like they're living in an alternate universe. Because what we're seeing is that Russia's being strategically defeated and is losing everywhere. Yet now we're being told that Russia is preparing for a 6 to 9 month massive offensive in multiple directions. They're not mutually exclusive. Well, they are mutually exclusive, apologies. You can't have both. Anyway, legends, let's start here and let's talk about attritional warfare and look back at some of the doctrine and then some of the information we've been sent before. Now, Tatarigami UA has reshared this post from The Atlantic that says Ukraine is not on the verge of collapse, and it is Russia, not Ukraine, that is losing the attritional war. Written by Mr. Phillips P. O'Brien and Elliot Cohen. Now, again, this is what I've been saying for a while. I think a lot in academia and analysts have been infected by using propaganda figures and narratives, and they're doing this because they don't want to receive the amount of backlash online, maybe government funding to their think tanks. This Phillips Payson O'Brien, he's a professor of strategic studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And I'm convinced guys like this know better and are not reporting it due to the backlash, because at this point in time, any serious analyst who is looking at this war and then knows anything about attritional doctrine and is realistically looking at the war, I cannot see how he can come to this conclusion. And Tatarigami UA says this: it's true that Trump's approach to Russia has been disastrous. I also agree that Ukraine is not on the verge of collapse, but claiming that Russia is losing the war of attrition is dangerous. Ukraine needs to inflict far greater casualties for the balance of attrition to shift. And Tatarigami UA, he's very correct when he says that this is very dangerous. And I've stated before that I believe a lot of these propagandists online, whether paid or unpaid, have blood on their hands. We'll go through the next couple of slides on this. But the main issue is that despite Russia sustaining higher casualties, we'll talk about that, it remains net positive overall due to significantly better recruitment. New vehicle deliveries for Ukraine are uncertain under the new administration, while losses continue to mount. Now, higher casualties for the Russians at this point in the war is very questionable. But let's talk about then these ideas in chronological order about is then the narrative around this dangerous, and then about casualty figures. And this is from Mr. Tatarigami UA in our somewhat like interview, but then I presented his side due to security risks. Now, he has said the disorganisation of the Russian side could have significantly improved the overall operational picture. However, Ukraine has undermined its advantage by launching costly and poorly planned offensives, deploying large motorised units to capture a few tree lines and villages with minimal tactical or operational value, in some cases even worsening their position to unfavourable geography. These attacks have tilted the casualty ratio from favourable to unfavourable. While this doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine is losing more troops, it does mean that the attrition rate is unsustainable. Given Russia's larger human reserves and superior mobilisation capacity, anything short of a 1-to-4 casualty ratio favours Russia. But this continues talking about propaganda and its then longer effects. Propaganda is a double-edged sword. Over time, it started working against Ukraine, making self-reflection harder. When the situation in Bakhmut was deteriorating and our team informed the casualty rates in close quarters combat weren't anywhere near the 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 ratios as some officials and analysts claimed, it became obvious that propaganda was getting people killed. It downplayed how bad things were and delayed the decision to withdraw from semi-encirclement. Essentially, propaganda started to cover leadership mistakes, making them feel a lack of accountability for their decisions. Bakhmut could have been a moment of reflection, a case study in why Ukraine needs to adjust certain approaches, even if you're trading casualties at 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, when the enemy has 3 to 4 times the population and is sending yesterday's prisoners against patriotic, motivated and professional soldiers. That's not really a win. Some self-reflection was badly needed. But anyone trying to raise these problems was quickly labelled a Russian agent, an FSB PSYOP, or some other label to discredit them. And we have seen this then change things on the front line absolutely for the worse in many, many ways. And this has come out today, and this shocked me, it concerned me, all of the above. Mr. Noel reports this from an interview. Russia's main strategy may now be to exhaust Ukraine's forces across the entire front line, rather than achieve operational successes. This is from the 3rd Army Corps Commander Biletsky. The goal is to wear down Ukraine militarily, morally, to force capitulation or collapse the front. You're just coming to this conclusion now. This concerns the hell out of me. Now, at least maybe publicly, I cannot believe that this conclusion wouldn't have been found years ago. Now, we're going to go over how then Russia fight and the way they have changed strategy from the Russian Art of War book to, watch my video below, also my criticisms on bits that this misses also. But again, like I said, this concerns me. 3 years ago, we saw Russia's decisive attack through manoeuvre did not achieve the desired outcome. That essentially, that initial attack, manoeuvre, decisive singular attacks on multiple axes, but all as one, did fail. It didn't reach the desired outcomes. So, following doctrine, they turned to attrition and attraction. What happened was Russia dug in. They mobilised. They made an economist then the defence minister for protracted warfare and knowing that their weakest point is the economy. They basically came to the idea of if we can't force Ukraine not to join NATO through manoeuvre and victory on areas, then we will attrit them to the point of capitulation and the outcome is the same. Therefore, Russia's war is primarily to have Ukraine not join NATO. So they will trade land back and forward wherever for the attritional positive percentage. Where Ukraine, they will not, as primarily their goal is then territorial as well. This is super concerning, and we're going to look at the doctrine, which we have presented over a number of years. It got me called all sorts of things about a propagandist, but at the end of the day, I don't think objectively you can actually disagree with it. This is what Russia did, and given then the timeframes, and this doctrine has nothing to do with Russia, it just has to do with attritional then warfare. Now, this is from the book. Again, watch the full thing, it's linked in the description. That it should be remembered that Russia's objective is not territorial, but security related, aka NATO. Unlike Ukraine, which prioritises the reconquest of territory over the lives of its men, this makes the withdrawal a victory shared by both sides. So if Russia can give up land, or they have the option to give up land to inflict higher casualties, they will. Where what we see from Bakhmut to Velika Novosilka to Kursk, Ukraine does not want to give up an inch of territory. Now, we talk about Vladimir Putin's declared objectives and then the demilitarization of this. But what they're wanting to do is not gain territory. It's to destroy potential, exactly like Mr. Biletsky has come to the conclusion in this. The Ukrainians are fighting for territory while Russians are seeking to destroy capabilities. You can always take back territory, but you can't get back human lives. And that is what Russia is trying to do in the attritional phase. And it scares me, frankly, that if this is only getting come to now, maybe it's just public outlook, but that I think a lot of this has been infected like a parasite from propaganda. So what am I on about? How am I going to back this up? Well, I'll back it up then with this of the art of attritional war. Basically, the doctrine of how this then looks. This has, again, anything with Ukraine or Russia in the title now is just brimming with then biases in it at this point, from the highest academics to the lowest bloggers. But let's go over this, and you can see where Russia years ago came to the conclusion that is now just being seen to. Instead of a decisive battle achieved through rapid manoeuvre, attritional war focuses on destroying enemy forces and their ability to regenerate combat power, as Mr. Jacker's board would say, their potential, while preserving one's own. So this decisive manoeuvre battle, this did not work in the beginning. So then Russia changed to this. Preserving one's own, of course, that withdrawal, Kherson, Kharkiv. In this context, a successful strategy accepts the war will last at least 2 years. As I then state here, they dug in, they mobilised, had very little movement. They used a PMC in 23, so not their actual forces on large, and made then later on an economist the defence minister. So therefore saying this war, we know we're accepting it's going to last years. What I will say is Russia is winning the war in 2024, 2025 due to decisions made in late 22, 23. And this was forced due to their failures in 2022. And on the reverse of this, that Ukraine being forced into an offensive in 2023 then jeopardised their ability to do this in years to come, as we have seen. But this is going to last 2 years, and it's broken into two distinct phases. The first phase ranges from initiation of hostilities to the point where sufficient combat power has been mobilised to allow decisive action. So we talk about Bakhmut, but again, the majority of the force and loss there was Wagner PMC. So this first phase, you have to then mobilise enough resources. And of course, for Russia to replace what was lost in 2022 in early on. It will see little positional shifting on the ground, focusing on favourable exchange of losses and building up combat power in the rear, as we saw. The dominant form of combat is fires, so artillery systems from, say, FABs to a traditional gun artillery to multiple launch rocket systems, but fires and missiles, it's all in that. It's that rather than manoeuvre, complemented by extensive fortifications and camouflage, Surovikin line, as we saw the acceptance of this. And as I've said over years on this channel, I think the primary reason for Russia's advantage that we have seen evolving over the past few years is the acceptance of attritional war. The peacetime army starts the war and conducts holding actions, providing time to mobilise resources and train the new army. So Russia's army in 22, they came in, they started the war, they conduct the operations, they have huge losses in the beginning, and then you mobilise the resources, the fortifications and the fires without much positional moving following that. Now this is very broad. I know we could find examples in this, but just broad phase. The second phase can commence after one side has met the following conditions. The second phase, of course, is the resumption of offensive operations. Newly mobilised forces have completed their training and gained sufficient experience. End of 22 through 23 into the beginning of 24. The enemy's strategic reserve is exhausted. We have seen, especially through then 24, that Ukraine has really suffered with the ability to regenerate manpower. Fires and reconnaissance superiority are achieved, which, yes, we have seen that. The enemy's industrial sector is degraded to the point where it's unable to replace battlefield losses. Now, Ukraine's industrial base is not in Ukraine, it is outside of Ukraine. So what Russia has been focused on to then degrade that, because they're not going to target that in Germany or Poland or the US, but what they can do is protract the war to the point where then we see like the US not wanting to give more arms. That this one's a bit of a grey area in this. But the attritional war, between Russia and Ukraine, has actually followed this bouncing ball of attritional warfare. And that's the reason why early preparation, 23, 22, fortifications, early mobilisation, whatever, has had huge effects down the line. Only after meeting these criteria should offensive operations commence. They should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks, just what Russia did in World War I with the Brusilov offensive, just like we're seeing Russia do now. There's shallow attacks across a broad front to overwhelm the enemy. And of course, this is like turbo boosted if you are numerically superior on the battlefield. Again, the idea of this like attritional war, back to these guys in here saying that it is then Russia who's losing the attritional war, Tatarigama UA, and then the doctrine, it just does not suggest that this is the case. Let's go then a further step, because remember, even if it's 1 to 3, then it's not in Ukraine's favour. Many claim higher, but then there is some doubt as to this too. Now, you may not even be able to read this. I'm sorry, I should have split this in a few, but this was a breakdown from someone behind the scenes about just having a look that I don't pretend to know the actual casualty figures, but I'm just trying to lay out some facts to get an idea of this. So you have to consider the following. Western sources, they claim that Russia has 2 to 7 times the advantage on artillery rounds fired, okay? And as you've noted, Russia has a massive advantage in thermobaric type weapons, standoff cruise ballistic missiles, and various aviation type bombs, such as FABs. There is no analogue in the Ukrainian forces for this, at least at the numerical figures that Russia can drop. So the no analogue situation occurring in the war where Ukraine routinely inflicts huge casualties on Russians to almost no losses of their own. This doesn't then occur where Russia does do this with cruise ballistic missiles and FABs. There's no analogue for that. Now, despite the Western propaganda to the contrary, all the hard evidence is that Russian soldiers are still receiving regular training lasting many months, and in the case of specialised troops, maybe a year. He's not suggesting that their training level is perfect, but their ability to train in areas has been far less affected than it has for Ukraine and in their ongoing mobilisation. Arguments have been made endlessly from both sides that one side or the other has better natural soldiers. I find this to be rubbish. Both sides have demonstrated exceptional skill, bravery, determination, and capability at various times throughout the war. It is true, the attacking force sometimes or often suffers higher casualties in assault operations than the defending force. However, the final assault, is only the final act in a long process. As you noted, the Russians follow a paint-by-number formula. So we see massive artillery and FABs, then TOS thermobaric types, and then the assault. And everyone's focusing on then that assault. That what the pro-Ukrainian commentators don't often acknowledge is that these preparations conducted by the Russians cause huge casualties. And this lines back up into this. There is no analogues occurring in the war where Ukraine routinely inflicts huge casualties on the Russians to almost no losses of their own. That we need to look at the entire battle sequence, and the entire battle sequence goes from the softening of this paint by numbers through to the tanks and infantry rolling on. And when the entire battle sequence is considered, the Ukrainians often start defending the assault down. He claims a large number here, but I think he's just thrown that out as if you'd say $1 million on account of artillery, drones, thermobarics, and aviation bombs. And this is where we can see that they only state these things as to say, I simply don't see a case where the Russian losses could logically be as high as the Ukrainians, even if we only accept reports coming from pro-Western sources about artillery and movements. Everything I've noted above can be found on multiple accounts from reports from Western sources. It makes an interesting point here, and I think this is very important right at the end. War itself doesn't care about narratives or hubris. It is cruelly unbiased affair where physics, mathematics, and logistics reign supreme. And this is my main critique of then Europe, is that they are focusing on these narratives, hubris, being right. therefore leading to might and success on the battlefield. And I think you take this in here and you look at these, and it's very difficult to have this idea where the casualties are not much closer, if not in the other way, at least in the second half of this war, than many think. And that some random dude sitting in his office with no university, failure at high school, can see this and go, this doesn't make sense. And then further, we go into this, and this goes into this idea of where propaganda is deadly. AP is reporting, but many are reporting this, that Ukrainians expect Russia to launch a fresh offensive to strengthen its negotiating position. In following paragraphs, they say that Russian forces are preparing to launch a fresh military offensive in the coming weeks to maximise pressure on Ukraine and strengthen the Kremlin's negotiating position in ceasefire talks. This is from Ukrainian government and military analysts. That the Kremlin is eyeing a multi-pronged push across the 1,000-kilometre front line. Again, according to these military commanders and analysts. Zelensky has said, as we reported, that Russia are dragging out the talk to try and get the US stuck in endless and pointless discussions about fake conditions to buy time, then grab more land. Now, land gives Russia a bargaining chip, a negotiating chip at the table. But Russia's goal, as your commander has just somehow discovered, their goal is attrition at this point to achieve their goals of security and NATO, not just a land grab. And we need to look at that first if you want to then see this anyway clearly. And this goes into the quote that I then said yesterday. Sorry, I've got quotes sitting everywhere. That understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision, or else you'll be starting at the wrong time, your wrong place, and you'll come to wrong conclusion. Now, again, with this offensive, isn't Russia out of everything? Aren't they out of men, money, machines, and morale? We've been told this for years. And then this is the propaganda backfire, that now we're getting told they're going to launch fresh military offensives across the 1,000-kilometre front line. And furthermore, in this attritional warfare doctrine, this goes on after this, and it talks about that you overwhelm on the broad front for shallow attacks until there's a collapse, and then you go into the deep rear. Is that the next step that we may see if they are able to launch this offensive? But let's speak about this propaganda backfire. And again, quoting Tatarigami Ue in our discussion together, propaganda is always a double-edged sword. It can give a serious morale boost and help in critical moments, but it always bites you back later if you aren't mindful. It made sense for Ukraine to push its own counter-propaganda, which was actually quite effective at first. Stories like the Grandma taking down the drone, it was a Su-34 I believe, with a pickle jar, the ghost of Kiev, and other exaggerations helped break the illusion that the Russian army was some kind of unstoppable force. But as I said, propaganda is a double-edged sword. Side note here, it is incredibly important for then the state propaganda and then the state's commanders to know what is and what then isn't. Over time, it started working against Ukraine, making self-reflection harder. Instead of addressing internal issues, Ukraine and its pro-Ukrainian community not only suppressed criticism, but allowed the situation within the Ukrainian army to deteriorate further. By the end of 24, this approach led to a full-blown crisis. Suddenly, Ukraine was facing severe manpower shortages, mobilisation struggles, and skyrocketing AWOL numbers, where all of these were, of course, a slow deterioration, but due to the propaganda sort of keeping that up, then we saw it then happen very suddenly. But if you went against the narrative at then all, you would then, to quote Tatarigami Ue again, anyone trying to raise these problems was quickly labelled a Russian agent, FSB PSYOP, or some other label to discredit them. So I guess by having such an idealistic approach to this war, so many false assumptions, therefore leading into command political decisions, has been infected and maybe been wrong or not the most efficient. Even down to this idea that Russia's goal is land. That may be a sub-goal, but their primary goal is that NATO, and that they will trade areas for that. Now, that may play in Ukraine's favour as well to get back some land, but that in frontline strategic tactical operations means that they will move around for attritional warfare, which apparently we've just fucking discovered. You can see I'm so disappointed by this because I actually give a shit about the guys on the front line who have been saying this. Look, 12 months ago, I shared from a guy very in the know here who basically said we're going to sack every senior commander and then all those like middle to lower command step in their positions because they're just not seeing the war for what it is. And I saw a quote today that a small Soviet army will not beat a big Soviet army. Okay? And as I've said before, Ukraine need to somehow reintroduce maneuver to the battlefield if that is possible. I can talk more on that if you would like and go through the doctrine of reintroducing maneuver. Okay, so let's look then at the maps. Of course, we have Ukraine in the centre of the screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014. Now, we're going to come down into Pokrovsk. We have a few areas to look at. So we just see a little bit of red out in here as well. Nothing too substantial. But what I want to do is then have a look at a couple of geolocations around this front line. Now, we see this footage here. Now, I won't show you the full thing. It's a few minutes long. But what we see is Russian tanks being then surveilled by Ukrainian drones as well as targeted by anti-tank drones, munitions as well, and some large fires here where some of these vehicles have then been defeated. So let's then look at the geolocation of this though. Now, I can hear it right now. People are going to say, your line is wrong. It should be from here, the closest area. Now, there's reason for this. But firstly, let's go. This is this then reservoir we see, and see where it dips down in here. That is where one of the geolocations took place. Why is my line from the closest point on this Zaporizhzhia front not from here? Because at least what I saw by the Russian pages, they were claiming that the Russians launched it from Zaporizhzhia, not from here. So these vehicles have had to travel, let's just go with 5 kilometers, about 3 miles, to this area. Okay, and where these vehicles were geolocated is only 3 kilometers from then Dnipro Oblast. That is important as well. But this is 5 kilometers. This is a breakthrough. It may have been defeated, but still did break through. And the page that released this footage was Ukrainian, and they said, quote, the unsuccessful breakthrough of Russian tanks ended in fiasco. They were repulsed and destroyed. But this is still a very long way, and grey zone needs to come right up into this area because, of course, we can see that that is not fully under control, and they were able to go 5 kilometers back. Could we see further movements deeper in the rear? Well, we will wait and see. Now, let's have a look at Pokrovsk on then this sector here. And this is the sector of which we are looking at, or maybe just to the south of here. This is Kotlyrivka. No, so we're at the same area. This is the reservoir right in here. So Surik is saying that the Russian army took control over the western part of Uspanivkia. So we need to look then up the map a little bit, and we see then Uspanivkia right here, that he said Russia took back some of this little bit in here. But in addition, in the last 48 hours, Russian forces made significant advances west of Nadivkia, but this is in this direction we have seen. So he is saying that that may have been successful. And what we have seen again and again is Russian failed attacks, but because they are simultaneous and successive, this is how to reintroduce maneuver warfare into the battlefield. We'll go over it. It's much more complex than this, but you need simultaneous and successive attacks. We see that again and again, regardless of losses, and then we see attacks that were failed 2 or 3 days' time. Then there is actually ground made. Now, I'm not going to question whether it's Pyrrhic or not, because it may be. It's hard to know, but we have seen that again and again. Initially has failed and then has actually become successful. But we need to come just down this map a little bit to Rozliv. And what we have seen is the washing machine portal has opened up again, and the Russian forces are in Rozliv, although only grey zone out to here. Now, many pages they're reporting that Russia actually control most of Rozliv at this point in time. So, again, a wait out on that. I think it's just a deep state do not want to show that advancement, and that's not the only case that we have today. So we have Pokrovsk, and then we have East Pokrovsk, heading down Sukabalka, Alexandropil, where this map did show Russian advances yesterday. So let's come in, and Suryak, he's showing around Sukabalka that there was more area occupied by the Russians. So not Sukabalka, but down on a 45-degree angle. But this Valatinivkia, this Patela-Movnivka, and Alexandropil has come under control by the Russian forces down in this direction. So just wait out on this. Remember, one of the things that's going to be very interesting to us is when this war ends, where the maps actually sit, because you won't be able to hide things at that point. Now let's come into then Kursk. Now, let's have a look because this map has shifted. We go back to the 28th. Sorry, just hard to see. 28th, what we looked at, and then 29th. So let's focus on the northern sector. Now, this is wrong because we saw right here a geolocation of a Russian flag going up and controlling that area. So that's incorrect. As well as yesterday, I showed you a geolocation approximately here by Russian forces as well. So at least would have to be grey zone, but a push in on then the north to south on this area of grey zone. Again, it's coming down, they're saying 69 square kilometres, but most maps say it's well under 50, some say it's well under that. But as well, of all areas not wanting to be shown, it will be then this. Now, let's have a look at then Syriac's update here. Now, again, difficult to see because they just show such a different idea. We need to come across a little bit, and what we can see is that Kursk front, the Russian army took control over abandoned locality of Veselivka. And then this is Veselivka in here where there is grey zone. And what I've been saying and concerning is that on 5 axes in here that Russia has pushed grey zone across the border. It'd be very interesting to see what then occurs in here. And he's saying this is Basivka, that's Basivka right there. He's saying this whole area has been cut off by the Russian forces. So again, wait and see. And you can just see the difference in size of this area down in here comparatively. So wait out on that. We'll get a better idea. Now, let's stay up in the north and have a look at this is where Ukraine crossed into Belgorod. Of course, we've seen and shown you geolocations of Ukrainian forces in Popovka and Demidovka as well. But we have seen that Russian forces, at least the first time I've seen this right here, are today in Popovka dropping FAB glide bombs on this locality. Remember, it goes by Russian forces standoff fires in this area, and we can see through this footage the dropping of FAB glide bombs. So again, we have seen that Russia didn't want to drop some of these glide bombs, and I reported from a source as well that they didn't want to drop them in Suja originally for then infrastructure reasons, and now we've seen them introduced onto this front. So just keep an eye up on this. Now let's continue our movement into the north, and then we'll come, of course, to the Dovrichnia Oskil front line, that's what I will call it. And we have seen Ukraine go back and forward in here, but Russia ultimately has been able to make a bridgehead across this. So let's have a look at this because this is very, very interesting today. Significant advancements from Fihilovkia all the way to Topoli. Russian army made new advances northwest of Topoli, up in here, following the recapture of Krasny Pershi, which we then spoke about yesterday. This is Krasny Pershi in here. Russian forces captured a series of positions north and south of the locality joined with the axis of Fihilovka. So the Fihilovka in here with the axis basically down to Zapadne, that this has met up and further pushed out around Dovrichnia. So it gives us a better idea at least of what may be happening in here. Again, very, very hard to tell. But as I always suggest, keep an eye on this front line because this to me is, I think, the most dangerous element of that short push to stretch and thin the opposing side. Now let's move our way down to the south. We're going all the way down to Velika Novosilka, Robotny, Lobkove area. Let's start though in Velika Novosilka where we see this grey zone movement out to then Vesely. So let's look on this, and what we can see is to the west around Bulatsky, and then the east around Rozdolny, we have seen advances, this Bulatsky, Rozdolny in here, as well as then to the south, this is showing then Rozdolny, the guys that have stepped through the portal. Now let's move our way down into the very south region, and Lobkove area, Orokhiv front, Kamyansky front. So let's have a look in here around Shabaki. Let me bring this up. So we see where this intersection is and where Shkabaki is. In the last 2 days, Russian army captured completely the locality of Shkabaki. Remember, they are claiming that around Lobkove, Stepove, Mali Shabaki and Shabaki have now come under control. Hard to know exactly what is happening here. Now, as you know, I'm trying to keep up with the fighter aircraft attrition loss to a production ratio. Now, I've actually lost the graph that I had that set this out, but we see that UAC, United Aircraft Company, they have posted on Telegram and said they have delivered the first batch of Su-35S fighters to the Russian Air Force. These are Gen 4++ fighters, undergo full cycle of factory tests, blah, blah, blah. Now, It appears in the video to be 2, but we never see them side by side. So let's just assume it's 1. Although, even if it's 1 here, with the recent loss to production ratio that we see, so this is the production ratio we are taking, it might be more than this anyway, at least what we see, and then the confirmed losses and even the actual claimed losses is actually now in a positive ratio for Russia, that they are making more jets over the past 6 to 12 months than they are losing. And we need to take into account as well, and this goes into what Tatarigami UA said, if you have a 1-to-4 attrition ratio, but it's one of your best, most motivated soldiers versus some prisoner, that's not positive. And this is an important thing here, that we see, say, Su-25s when they go down, but they're being outweighed by the production of Su-35, Su-34, much more modern, much more deadly aircraft. Although there is a very much a position, of course, for Su-25 with their close air support position, but still. Legends, you can see that I am passionate about this because I know the reality of the front line and what it fucking looks like for the guys there. Anyway, legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.